Well, now to discuss the conflict in Israel, I'm joined by retired Army General and former CIA Director, General David Petraeus. General, great to have you on the programme again. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Are you confident that we will, in the next few days, perhaps weeks, see a full-blown ground invasion by Israeli forces of Gaza?
I think it is very, very likely. I think it's essentially inescapable. If the mission for the military is to destroy Hamas, that can't be done from the air. And clearly, then they will face these enormous challenges that you have described. And I hope that as part of announcing the onset of the operation, that there will also be a vision provided for the Palestinians in Gaza after Hamas is destroyed. As you'll recall, when we did the surge in Iraq, we sought to separate the Sunni Arab population from al-Qaeda and the Sunni insurgents. And we laid out, here's what life could be like for you when they are gone. And I think that has to be done here as well. I agree very much with what you laid out. Hamas has brought this existential moment on them. This is their fault, their horrific actions, keeping in mind that 1,400 innocent Israeli citizens would equate to 50,000 Americans per capita. So we need to keep this in perspective, how significant that has been for a country of 9.3 million people. And the 200 hostages would be 7,000. So again, the magnitude of this to the Israelis, the recognition that you noted as well, that Hamas is founded on the notion of destroying Israel and of killing as many Jews as is possible. I think there's no choice for the Israelis, but after further, as ideally precise as is possible, airstrikes, because as you note, hearts and minds will matter here. And they have to be very conscious of that. Urban combat is inevitably destructive. There are inevitably innocent civilian lives lost, especially in a scenario that is as challenging as this one. An enemy who doesn't wear a uniform, uses human shields, will use the hostages in that role, fights from within the civilian populations, 300 miles of underground tunnels under Gaza City, and so forth and so on. So this will be a very, very hard fight, inevitably destructive, but the hope has to be that out of this will come something better, not just for Israel, but for the Palestinian people in Gaza. And so that vision of what follows has to be sorted out. And I think it ideally would be announced at the same time as they announce the ground operation. And I think there should be a vision for the people, the Palestinian people in the West Bank as well.
I mean, you've written this fascinating and very timely book, Conflict, with Andrew Roberts, in which I saw an interview you gave last weekend, I think it was, in the Sunday Times, and you were talking about the reality of these situations where you can take a town or city, as you did in Iraq, but the real problem may start when you take a town or city. In other words, once you assume control of somewhere, and assume for a moment that Israel takes control of Gaza, what do you then do? It can be as difficult an issue as getting in there.
It can be more difficult, frankly. We experienced this as the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, a two-star general. During the invasion, we took the first major city. We were ordered to do that. 3 days of very tough fighting. The enemy collapsed, and I called my boss and I said, hey, I've got good news and bad news. Good news is we own Najaf. He asked, what's the bad news? We own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? And there wasn't a plan for that. We ended up having to leave military forces for it. But then we had an even bigger challenge after we took Baghdad, toppled the regime, and all the bureaucrats we needed to run the country melted away. And again, we had inadequate post-conflict planning. In fact, inadequate would probably be charitable. And then we compounded that by pursuing policies that increased the numbers of individuals who had an incentive to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it by firing the Ba'ath Party all the way down to the level of bureaucrats we needed to run the country. Most of them were Western educated and quite secular, and of course also fired the army without telling them how we would enable them to provide for their families. So it also raises the issue of conducting operations in ways that don't create more bad guys than they take off the street by their conduct. And again, all of these, the Israeli leaders are keenly aware of these particular challenges, these paradoxes, these difficulties of conducting operations in very densely populated urban areas against an enemy who, we should also note, is willing to blow himself up to take Israeli soldiers with him.